The day they put me in the nursing home, my son Marcus smiled the way people smile when they think they have finally won. He held my hand at the entrance, spoke to the staff, and told them I had chosen to come. I had chosen nothing. I did not know where we were going until the car stopped, and I saw the sign above the gate. I was 81 years old, and my children had decided, without asking me, that my time in my house was finished. What they did not know was that the house still carried my name on the deed, and I had called a lawyer. But to understand what happened that morning, you need to go much further back. You need to understand what that house meant to me, and why I had never signed ownership away to anyone. You need to understand who I was before my children began treating me as a problem to be managed rather than a father to be loved. This is not simply a story about old age and ingratitude. This is the story of a man who spent his life building, giving, and trusting, and who discovered too late that some people mistake generosity for surrender. I was not surrendering. I was watching, and everything I did next was entirely within my rights. Before I continue, I want to invite you to do something. If this story is already touching a nerve, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. You are not alone if you have ever been dismissed by people who were supposed to love you most. This community exists because these stories exist, and they happen in real homes to real people more often than anyone admits. That connection matters to me. Now let me tell you who I am and how I found myself standing in a parking lot with a suitcase I did not pack myself. My name is Arthur. I spent 41 years as a civil engineer. I designed bridges, drainage systems, and public infrastructure across 4 counties. I retired at 67 with a clean record and a pension that covered my needs. My wife Martha and I had been married for 40 years. She died of cancer 6 years ago, and I cared for her through every stage of it without hiring outside help, because that is what you do for the person who is the center of your life. After she was gone, the house became very quiet. My children came for the funeral, and then, one by one, they began to find reasons to return. Marcus was the first to move in. He said it was to keep me company. His wife Karen wanted to be near her sister, or so he said. I gave them the study and the best guest room and thought nothing of it. Then David arrived 3 months later with a similar story. Gloria visited often, and I welcomed her without examining her reasons. Within 8 months, my house held 3 of my adult children, 2 of their partners, and 2 grandchildren I rarely saw outside of mealtimes. I cooked for them, I stayed out of their way, and I told myself this was what family looked like when lives overlapped. I was wrong, but I did not yet know how wrong. That house was not simply a building. I had drawn the original blueprints myself on a wide oak table I kept in the back room. I chose the placement of every window, every doorway, every beam in the ceiling. I worked overtime for 2 years to pay for construction without borrowing a cent. Martha planted the garden herself. The oak tree near the back fence grew from a cutting she brought from her mother's land. 34 years of our life had settled into those walls. When I stood on the back porch in the evenings, I was not merely looking at a yard. I was reading every year we had spent building something together. The deed was registered in my name alone. That had been a practical arrangement at the time, and after Martha died, I lacked the emotional energy to revisit any legal documents. I left everything as it was because I trusted my children without question. I had paid Marcus's university fees. I had co-signed David's first business loan. I had given Gloria the down payment for her apartment. I had never counted these things or expected repayment. I gave because they were mine, and I could. The house was the one thing that remained entirely in my hands, and I never imagined that fact would become the reason they wanted to remove those hands from it. The morning after the anniversary of Martha's death, Marcus sat at the kitchen table and told me they were thinking of renovating the downstairs bathroom. He said it would improve the property's value. I nodded and said it sounded sensible. I did not understand that this conversation had nothing to do with tiles or plumbing. It was the first open declaration that they no longer thought of this place as my home. They were thinking of it as an inheritance already in progress. I noticed it in the word Marcus used. He did not say the house or your home. He said property, a word that removes the person and leaves only the transaction. The changes arrived gradually, which is how this kind of erosion always begins. Marcus asked to use my reading room as a home office. I agreed. Within 3 weeks, my books were boxed in the hallway, and a computer screen stood where my armchair had been for 30 years. I asked if I could keep a shelf of my things in the corner. He said the room was too small for both. I carried the boxes to my bedroom and said nothing. I was still telling myself it was temporary, that people needed adjustments, that this was what family looked like when lives shared space. I was wrong about every part of that sentence, but I kept telling myself otherwise because I was not yet ready to know the truth. The dinner schedule changed without discussion. Martha and I had eaten at 7 every evening for decades. Karen announced one afternoon while I was still at the stove that they would begin eating at 6 because it was better for the children's routines. I was not asked. When I mentioned that 6 was too early for me, Karen glanced at Marcus. Marcus looked at the floor, and no one answered. I ate alone at 7 that evening, standing at the kitchen counter because my chair, the one at the head of the table, had been moved to make room for a cabinet Karen had ordered and placed without consulting me about anything in my own home. On a Tuesday, I went to the garage and found it empty. Marcus said the car was at the mechanic. 2 weeks passed. I asked again, and David happened to be visiting. The two brothers exchanged a look I had learned to recognize. David said my vision had been declining and that driving was becoming a safety concern. I had just passed my annual eye examination without a single note of concern. I said so. Marcus said they were being careful. The car never came back. Standing in that empty garage, looking at the oil stain Martha's old sedan had left on the concrete floor, something inside me became very quiet. Not broken. Certain. Karen began referring to the house as ours. Not in front of me at first, but her voice carried and she knew it. I heard her on the telephone with a friend, walking the woman through room measurements and describing renovation plans. She said this house has enormous potential. She said we are going to turn it into something. She did not say my father-in-law's house. She said this house, as if the person who had built every wall of it with his own savings and his own blueprints had already been subtracted from the equation. I was in the next room. She knew I could hear her. The fact that she kept talking was itself the message. In March, I arrived at my doctor's office for a checkup and was told the appointment had been canceled by a family member. The new appointment was with a geriatric specialist I had never requested. No one at home mentioned this when I returned. When I asked Marcus about it that evening, he said it was a scheduling error. I did not press him, but I noted that the calendar in the kitchen now showed my medical appointments in Karen's handwriting rather than mine, and that next to one upcoming date someone had written in small letters, "Final evaluation." No one explained what that meant. I did not ask. I already understood it perfectly. The moment I returned to most often happened on a Sunday in April. Gloria had come to lunch with her husband. I had cooked the lamb stew Martha used to make and set the table with the good napkins. Marcus poured wine for everyone. He did not pour one for me. When I reached for the bottle, Karen's hand arrived first, covering my glass. She said the doctor had suggested I avoid alcohol. I do not have a problem with alcohol. I have had 1 glass of wine on Sundays for my entire adult life. I placed my hand back in my lap. I looked at the table, and I made a decision in that moment that no one in the room could see. The document was not hidden. It sat on the kitchen counter on a Wednesday morning, half beneath the fruit bowl. A printed email chain between Marcus and a woman named Patricia from a care facility. The subject line read, placement confirmation, and timeline. I stood in the kitchen and read what was visible, then pulled the papers out slowly. The chain discussed my placement as if it had already been decided. The word voluntary appeared once, in quotation marks, with a notation below it describing how to present the transition so the subject would not become distressed. Subject. That is what I had become. Not a father, not a man. A subject. A case. A transition. Beneath the email was a second document. A letter from a real estate attorney addressed to Marcus and David, discussing the property transfer process in the case of a legal guardianship appointment. I had to read the sentence twice. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. If they succeeded, a guardian would be appointed, my right to manage my own affairs would be suspended, and control of my assets would transfer accordingly. The house would follow. It was a clean, legal plan. I could see in the language that someone had thought about this carefully, and that it had been in motion for some time before I found these papers sitting openly on my kitchen counter. I sat at the table for a long time. I thought about Martha. I thought about the day we stood in these rooms with paint on our hands, laughing because nothing was perfectly level, and it did not matter at all. I thought about the school fees and the loan signatures and the sleepless nights I spent worrying so my children could rest without worry. I thought about what it means to give everything to someone and have that generosity treated as an invitation to take more. And then I stopped thinking about those things. Grief would not help me now. I folded both documents, placed them inside my jacket, and went to the telephone. Edward Chen had been my lawyer for 22 years. He had handled Martha's estate, the sale of my engineering practice, and several property matters before that. When I called, I told him I needed an appointment urgently and would explain everything in person. He heard the particular steadiness in my voice that comes not from calm, but from resolution, and he said he could see me that same afternoon. I told Karen I was going for a walk. I put on my jacket, walked to the end of the street, and called a taxi. It was the first truly independent action I had taken in months. It felt like being able to breathe fully after a very long time underwater. Edward listened without interrupting. When I placed the two documents on his desk, he read them carefully. Then he looked at me and asked whether I was mentally competent and willing to prove it formally. I told him I had never been otherwise. He recommended an independent neurological evaluation with a certified specialist. He also recommended a formal review of the property deed and a full legal consultation about my rights as sole owner. He told me to say nothing at home. He told me to change nothing in my behavior. He said the most powerful position I could hold was the appearance of someone who had noticed nothing at all. I walked out of his office feeling something I had not felt in months. Direction. The neurological evaluation took place the following week at a private clinic. The specialist was a woman named Dr. Alvarez. She tested memory, reasoning, sequencing, language, spatial orientation, and judgment across a 3-hour session. When she handed me the results, she said my scores were above average for my age group and fully consistent with legal competence. She signed the report in 2 places and sealed it. Edward filed it with the court registry, creating an official record that any future guardianship attempt would have to overcome in open court with contradicting medical evidence, which did not exist. The plan my children had been building had just encountered a wall they had not anticipated and could not see yet. Edward introduced me to a real estate agent named Sandra the following week. She knew the neighborhood well and had handled several properties nearby. I asked for a discreet valuation and a full assessment of the sale process for a property I owned outright. She visited on a Thursday morning while Marcus and Karen were at work. She walked through every room, examined the garden, and looked at the original blueprints I had kept rolled in the back room for 30 years. When she left, she gave me a figure that surprised me. The market had shifted considerably since I had built the house. The property was worth far more than I had imagined. I told her to begin the process immediately. For 6 weeks, I sat in my usual chair each morning, ate what was placed in front of me, spoke when spoken to, and watched. I watched Marcus and Karen discuss renovation plans without any awareness that I was listening. I watched David arrive on a Saturday with paint samples and hold them against the living room walls. I watched Gloria nod along as Karen described her plans for the master bedroom, which had been the room where Martha and I had slept for 34 years. I watched all of this with a cup of tea and said nothing. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the most precise instrument available to a patient man who already knows the outcome. The sale was completed through a development company that intended to build 2 residential units on the land. The legal transfer was handled by Edward and a notary, with the certified neurological evaluation on file and 2 independent witnesses present at the signing. I signed the documents at Edward's office on a Friday morning. After the signing, Sandra handed me a sealed envelope with the financial confirmation. I took the bus to the city center, where I had opened a new bank account the previous month, at a branch far from the neighborhood where my children had been making their plans. The transaction was complete. The house belonged to someone else, and no one at home knew yet. On the following Sunday, Marcus told me we were going for a drive. He said there was a place he wanted me to see, a residential community with good facilities. He said it was only to have a look. He packed a bag for me while I sat on the bed. He packed the wrong shoes and forgot my reading glasses. Karen held the front door open with one hand and scrolled through her phone with the other. When the car turned out of the street, I looked back through the rear window. The oak tree Martha had planted was visible above the back fence. I looked at it and said goodbye the way you say goodbye to something that is already fully yours and always will be. I learned later, through a neighbor who still called me, that Marcus held a dinner party the following Saturday. He invited several neighbors and walked them through the house with the ease of a man explaining his own domain. Karen served wine in Martha's good glasses and spoke about renovation plans with enthusiasm. Marcus reportedly told the guests he intended to remove the oak tree because it blocked too much natural light. The dinner lasted past midnight. While they were celebrating, I was sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in the facility, and the house had already been sold to a developer 11 days earlier. I read for a while that evening. Then I slept very well. The certified letters arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by hand to Marcus, David, and Gloria simultaneously. Edward had arranged for each envelope to contain a letter from the notary confirming that the property had been legally sold by its sole owner 11 days prior. The transfer was complete, registered, and fully binding. All occupants were given 60 days to vacate the premises in accordance with standard property law. Each envelope Marcus called within 30 minutes. The voice on the phone was not the careful, measured voice he had used in the parking lot. This was the voice of a man discovering that the ground under his certainty was hollow. He said, "I could not do this." He said the house was the family home. He said he would challenge the sale in court. I told him the deed had always been in my name alone. I told him about the neurological evaluation, the notary, the witnesses, the registered transfer. I told him his lawyer was welcome to contact Edward at any time. Then I told him I hoped he and his family found a comfortable place to live. I ended the call. He rang back 4 more times. I did not answer. David came to the facility 2 days later. He sat across from me in the common room and said quietly that I had destroyed the family. I told him I disagreed. I said I had exercised a legal right that had always belonged to me. I reminded him that none of them had ever paid rent, because there was no rent arrangement. I reminded him that none of them had contributed to maintenance, property taxes, or repairs. I reminded him that the renovation plans they had been discussing involved changes to a building I legally owned at the time of those discussions. I told him I bore him no hatred. But I told him clearly that I had not been the one who started this. I remained at the facility for 2 months while Edward located a suitable apartment. It was on the 3rd floor of a building near the city park, with a balcony that caught the morning light. 2 rooms, a kitchen of my own. I furnished it slowly, with care, choosing each item without consulting anyone. I placed Martha's photograph on the shelf beside the window and arranged my books along the wall the way I had always preferred them. I hung the original blueprints of the old house in the hallway, not from sentiment, but as a record. I had built something with my hands and my years. The fact that someone else now owned the land did not erase the fact that I had built it. A portion of the sale proceeds went directly to the cancer charity that had supported Martha's care in her final months. The director sent me a handwritten note of thanks, which I had framed and placed beside her photograph. My children did not reach out for several months. Marcus eventually called with something that resembled an apology. I listened. I did not close the door entirely, but I also did not pretend that what had happened was a misunderstanding or a simple misstep. It had been a plan, carefully assembled, and I had met it with a plan of my own. Whatever relationship might eventually be rebuilt would have to rest on honesty rather than on the assumption that an old man's patience is a form of helplessness. What I did was not revenge. It was the restoration of a right that had always been mine and had never been surrendered. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten anyone or break any law. I consulted a lawyer, underwent a proper evaluation, and made a legal decision about property that bore my name. The system protected me because I had never abandoned my responsibility to myself. Before you go, I have one question for you. If the people closest to you had tried to take everything you built while betting that your age made you easy to override, what would you have done? Would you have let it go to preserve the peace? Or would you have shown them, quietly and legally, exactly whose name was on the deed? Tell me in the comments below.